In Canada, Indigenous peoples experience multiple forms of disadvantage and marginalization, including disproportionately high rates of victimization and pervasive systemic racism and discrimination, which can deter or prevent accessing services. Indigenous women are 3 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to experience family violence, and 4 times more likely to be murdered or go missing. The ongoing legacy of abuse in residential schools also contributes to intergenerational violence and is an example of how systems of colonization have perpetuated violence against Indigenous peoples. Today, I would like to talk to you about Indian residential schools and how they relate to something called intergenerational trauma. First, we must understand what Indian residential schools were by looking at how and why they came into existence, before we can look at the aftermath and how they impacted and continue to affect Indigenous people today. In 1876, the Canadian government, under the leadership of Sir John A. Macdonald, passed the Indian Act. This legislation was a blueprint for controlling, administering, and assimilating Canada's Indigenous people. Shortly after this legislation passed, the government established residential schools to convert and civilize the Indigenous people. Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, contributed in large part to the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples and in creating and supporting the residential school system in Canada. In total, over 130 residential schools operated in Canada between 1831 and 1996. Residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Residential schools were created by Christian churches and the Canadian government as an attempt to both educate and convert Indigenous youth and to assimilate them into Canadian society. Prior to the creation of residential schools, the government and colonizing settlers had hoped or expected that the Indigenous people would simply give up their ways of life and embrace European languages and culture. Frustrations grew when this didn't happen, and there was restlessness among the colonizers as they wanted to clear the way for new settlers by either removing the Indigenous communities from their land or assimilating them and forcing them to give up their rights as separate peoples. Following in the footsteps of the United States and adopting models of their industrial school system, the concept of removing Indigenous children from their parents and educating them separately in a boarding school type setting would aid them in achieving their goal of forced and aggressive assimilation. The goal was to resolve the so-called Indian problem, so in 1883, the Canadian government officially implemented the residential school system. By the 1930s, nearly 70% of all Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15 were forced to attend these residential schools. An estimated 150,000 children attended residential schools, and according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, an estimated 6,000 children died there, and others went missing, never to be found again. Unable to return home for months or even years, these Indigenous children were often neglected and abused. Many Indigenous children were taken by force or were kidnapped by government officials. They were stripped of their language and culture and ultimately their identity as Indigenous children. Parents who withheld their children or who tried to remove them from the schools faced arrest or imprisonment. Overall, students had negative experiences at the residential schools, one that would have lasting consequences. Many students suffered both physical and sexual abuse at residential schools. In some cases, children were heavily beaten, chained, or confined. Underfed and malnourished, the children were particularly vulnerable to diseases as well. There are approximately 80,000 survivors of these residential schools. For many, the trauma of the physical, psychological, and sexual abuse they suffered still haunts them today. Intergenerational trauma refers to how trauma is passed down through the generations. The children and grandchildren of survivors inherit the pain and suffering as the wounds are manifested through depression, anxiety, family violence, suicide, and alcohol and substance abuse. Survivors also lost their culture and any connections they had with their families and their communities. In many cases, these Indigenous children grew up in these residential schools full of fear and void of any proper familial upbringing and not knowing what it was like to have parents and a loving family. These children were left in rooms to take care of themselves. Nobody to put them to bed and say goodnight. No nurturing, no comforting, no loving embrace or connection. Not having experienced a normative family environment meant that these children would grow up not knowing how to parent their own children. Then their children would suffer the consequences of the trauma that their parents endured. Thus, the intergenerational trauma perseveres. Memories of residential school experiences would be debilitating for survivors, which often led to depression and alcohol and substance abuse as coping mechanisms for the trauma they experienced. So where do we go from here? Hope, resiliency, courage, and strength are all aspects needed for healing and moving forward. Healing is necessary to end the cycle of intergenerational trauma. For some, that would mean returning to their culture and taking back what was taken from them. It would mean having the freedom to take back what was once theirs. On June 8, 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, offered a formal apology on behalf of the Government of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools.
Taking full responsibility and apologizing to former students of Indian residential schools for their part that Canada played in the provision of these schools. This was a first step in recognizing and acknowledging the pain and suffering endured and the damaging effects caused by the residential school system. The intention was that a formal apology would help put the pain behind them and give all an opportunity to grieve and to heal. Acknowledging the past, revoking or repealing laws and policies that are discriminatory to Indigenous peoples, making genuine efforts towards reconciliation and having empathy and remorse in order to allow for healing is essential for change. The healing journey after experiencing life at residential schools is still a long road ahead. Arguably, the residential school system in Canada is one of the biggest tragedies in our whole history as a country. The damage that has been done to so many lives and the damage that continues to be done and what will be felt intergenerationally is beyond anything anyone could ever imagine. Prime Minister Harper promised that this would never happen again, but there is still much work to be done to help the Indigenous people overcome the intergenerational trauma that ensued as a result of the residential schools and the experiences the victims and survivors went through. They need compassion from all Canadians and the help and support from the Canadian government to rebuild stronger communities and advance the culture and traditions that were lost from one generation to the next. Rebuilding and flourishing in the aftermath of trauma and breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma can only be achieved when dignity, confidence, and respect for traditional values and basic human rights are invested in and embraced. Mutual respect, empathy, and understanding are the basic foundations for harmony to exist among Canadians and the Indigenous people. In conclusion, intergenerational trauma is one of the most tragic outcomes resulting from residential schools. Indigenous children came out of residential schools, those who survived that is, feeling ashamed for being Indian. They didn't fit in their communities anymore, and they didn't fit in Eurocentric Canada either. They were lost in a society that neither wanted them nor accepted them. The consequences of residential schools, such as significant physical, psychological, and sexual trauma, family breakdowns, violence, alcohol and substance abuse and addictions, as well as hopelessness and despair, are all long-term effects resulting from attending these residential schools. These consequences then impact intergenerational trauma as the cycle is perpetuated from one generation to the next. The fallout of this trauma still persists today, and it has had devastating consequences on the Indigenous people and their culture. We as Canadians did this to them, and we as Canadians need to be a part of the reconciliation and healing journey. We can never make it right, but we can show empathy, compassion, and support for the survivors and their communities, as we are all human beings on the long journey of healing and reconciliation together.